Mobile hunters, if you're looking to up your mobile game, head to tetherednation.com and check out all of their saddle gear. Regardless if you're new to saddle hunting or an old tree climbing veteran, Tethered will have your mobile hunting needs covered. I've been using and trusting Tethered gear since they launched and have used it in all types of hunting situations, from the mountains of Pennsylvania to the plains of Kansas. It has been the constant in my hunting gear and allows me to be as mobile and as versatile as the hunt requires. My favorite pieces of gear currently is my Phantom saddle, the ultralight one-stick climbing sticks, the Predator platform, and the Fast Pack, which is the best hunting pack for a mobile hunter in my opinion. Also makes a great scouting and trail camera hanging pack. If you're looking for gear to help up your game and be more mobile, keeping you in the hunt, then head over to tetherednation.com. Welcome to the Truth on a Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. I'm your host, Clint Campbell, and you're listening to episode number 339. Today, we're strolling down memory lane with a look-back episode to talk trail camera strategies, buck bedding, and much more. So stay tuned. All right. What is up, everyone? Happy Wednesday to you. Hope you're doing well. Hope you are feeling fine. This past weekend was a beaut. Finally got out, got some trail cameras out. Didn't get all of them out. Actually, I got about half as many out on Saturday as I wanted to get out. Finally made it up to the North Piece. Hung a couple cameras, and I found me a hammer scrape. So that kind of made everything all right. I put on some miles, had the intention of really kind of fixing or resetting one camera, if you will, which was a cell camera, and then hanging. My plan was to hang 4 more, and I was kind of going to an area that, I had some cameras in a general area, but I was kind of expanding the footprint, and I really didn't even get to scout. Well, not even really. I didn't get to scout the area that I was going to at all this winter or spring. So I was kind of going in blind. You guys have heard me talk about it before. I don't prefer to scout during the summer. Just it's for obvious reasons. You have limited visibility. You can't see. Sun has been laid on down on the ground as well. Rubs now harder to tell. How old they might be, if it's from this year, previous years, whatever the case is. So you're really kind of relying, or I'm at least relying on historical kind of rub data, if you will. So I'm just looking at, are there old rubs in the area? Are there a couple pieces that are kind of pointing to this area? Are there clearly defined trails that I can see at this point? Are there old rubs and clusters of them? Potentially, I can't tell maybe what year they're from, but at least I know the bucks have used this area. And then, of course, if I'm finding scrapes this time of year, then they're usually pretty sizable and usually pretty obvious, because there's just a lot of ground cover, especially this area that I'm hunting or have been scouting. There's just a ton of kind of fern kind of ground cover everywhere. But as luck would have it, I ended up only hanging I wanted to put out 4 additional cameras. I ended up getting 2 out and covered some miles. But there was one really good find where I found a hammer scrape that had a bunch of old historical kind of rubs around it. And so I felt pretty good about that one. It was kind of a janky setup. There wasn't any great trees to put a camera in. So hopefully that one doesn't get legs and walk away. The good news is it's kind of far back off the beaten path, if you will, from any kind of parking area. So fingers crossed that it doesn't grow legs and walk away. I did lock it up, so hopefully it manages to stick around. But anyway, with that, we're going to go ahead and just kind of get started with today's episode. Before we do that, though, I want to make a quick mention. I mentioned it in the past couple podcasts, but our buddies over at Exodus are celebrating their 8th year anniversary. They've been in business for 8 years now, and with that, they are doing a campaign specifically for you guys. So if you've been eyeing up any Exodus products for a while, and want to treat yourself to something new, right now is the time to do it, because they're doing a deal that is only going to run until, I believe it is June 12th. So I think this started on May 19th. So it's been going on for a couple weeks now, but you can save 25% off the entire Exodus website. So with this deal, Exodus will only be offering this specific savings for 300 Exodus renders and 300 rival cameras. So if you want to get into the cell game and they haven't sold out of those yet, which I haven't heard that they have to this point, no one's texted me and let me know, then you'll want to jump on it right now. You can also use the promo code TFTS. That'll lock in your 25% savings. And that, as I'd mentioned, will last until June 12th or until supplies supplies last. So in case you need to become familiar with what Exodus has to offer, let me tell you about some of the favorite stuff that I like about them. So I use pretty much exclusively all their SP18 solar panels on every one of my cameras. So whether it's a SD card camera or a cell camera, I always pair my cameras with an SP18. That way I don't have to worry about changing batteries throughout the year. I, of course, am running the renders. I have hung a couple rivals yesterday. And the thing that I appreciate most about the Exodus products just in general is that, man, some of these cameras I've had out in the woods and I don't take them out in certain locations, and they've been there for years and they just work. So if you're wanting to get into a quality camera, right now is the time to do it. So the Exodus Render, of course, is their flagship cell camera that's powered by their 4G LTE technology. Super fast transmission times makes it one of the speediest cameras in the industry. Plus, it's incredibly user friendly and dependable. This ensures that the products work flawlessly when it matters most. You can save up to $125 when purchasing the Exodus Render Security Bundle. Again, using that code TFTS at checkout. Or you can click the link in the show notes of this specific podcast episode. That link will take you automatically to the Exodus website, exodusoutdoorgear.com, and it will apply the savings at checkout for you. So with that, have a super cool show for you guys today. We're doing a look back episode. So between the past couple weekends, going to the North Piece and going on vacation with the wife the previous weekend over the Memorial Day holiday, had a lot of time to drive. And I don't often do this, but when I have time to drive, what I like to do sometimes is go back, and listen to some specific guests that we've had on that has kind of mentioned specific kind of things, or that I really enjoyed the conversation, or there was like a nugget drop that I want to go back and kind of listen to again as the season is kind of approaching, and I need to be kind of thinking of these things or have these things in my mind. And so I had time to actually do that as I was driving, just kind of jotted down some notes, some of the things that I thought were interesting with some of these episodes. And so wanted to put together a look back series. And what I do is I kind of take snippets from different conversations that I thought were really interesting and kind of tee them up in a very kind of bite-sized way for you guys to, not have to listen to an entire episode from 6 months ago that has a nugget of information that might be helpful. And so in this episode, I'm highlighting some stuff or some parts of the conversation with Justin Hollandsworth. If you know him, he's a big buck killer. My buddy Jacob Emery, who had a couple killer seasons, and interesting ways that he accesses things. But specifically, we kind of talk about his trail camera strategy overall, because he's really, especially when we start talking about early season, because that's really his favorite time of the year. It might be part of a season that we, often overlook. The conversation with Casey Smith from The Element, he's a big time travel hunter. So we talk about that and how, your style might evolve as you travel hunt and how things might change, and then building, analogs and analogies to help you kind of, keep to your strategy, but evolve your strategy as you get to like these different kind of environments and different terrain that you might be hunting. And then Dr. Bronson Strickland, which was probably one of my favorite podcasts from the past 12 months or 12 plus months. And we, Dr. Bronson Strickland is from MSU Deer Lab. And then that episode, we talk a lot about buck bedding and the research that he did related to that. And so we talk about the October lull, movement related to the lull, and just movement in general for mature deer. And then also just bedding consistency. If you haven't listened to that episode its entirety, I would go ahead and check that out. I think it's episode 293, but I have a really cool snippet of that one in this episode. And then we have our good buddy, Mr. Greg Litzinger, on. We had a session that we did last summer where we talked about efficiency and kind of how he's evolved and maybe going back to how he used to do things when he was younger. And then we also talk about that kind of prime time, the target dates that Greg and I really like and that we've seen kind of year over, and that we've talked to hunters from other places, and they also see those dates kind of play out consistently in their areas as well. So hope you guys dig the episode. And as always, thank you all for listening. All right, gang, first up, we have the discussion. I think it was episode 288 where we talked with Justin Hollandsworth. And in this clip, the one thing we talked about, I guess the precursor to this kind of statement that he makes, is that we were kind of talking about moisture and, deer liking kind of that those drizzly kind of, or I should say mature deer, liking those drizzly kind of rainy, days. Not a soaker, but just those days where you have a little extra humidity in the air or a little extra moisture on the ground. And there was a study that was done at some point where deer, especially I think it was in the South, preferred that kind of really humid day for movement. Whenever they had that, they moved a lot more freely, a lot more frequently, and just a little bit more broadly. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about what Justin talks about here a little bit is his experience in running dogs. I think for coon hunting and how much more precise they were, or how much better their nose was if they could get out in the morning with a little bit of dew on the ground, a little bit of moisture on the ground, or even just after like a light misty rain or humid, or just a humid day or whatever the case is. And so he talks a little bit about that, but then he also talks about how those dogs would drift tracks. And then thinking about that in relationship to how deer are likely drifting our tracks when we're using, entry areas for entry and exit. And that when we think we're clean, we may not be as clean in and out as we had previously thought. If we think about, deer who have a better nose than a canine, drifting our tracks. So let's go ahead and hear from Justin.
Well, and I noticed too, like when I was running dogs, that there was a lot of times, say we were like in a drought or something like that, and I was out in the summertime, running my dogs or whatever. And when it was really dry, and we're in a 2, 3, 4 week drought or something like that, where we just haven't really got any rain. I mean, the dogs would struggle a little bit, and being able to consistently, stay on that track, because a good competition coon dog will drift the track. They won't run right on the track. They will drift it. They will use the wind, because what they're trying to do, this is what I think anyways, what they're trying to do is they're trying to run the coon down. And they're trying to, ultimately, they would like to catch it on the ground. And some really good competition dogs, a lot of the old timers, they called it, having a hot nose. And so what they would do, instead of running like right, and following that track exactly where the coon went, they would like drift it and cut it off at certain points so they could run it faster, and ultimately tree the coon faster. And so, and I noticed, like, on the super dry days like that, like, that just wasn't happening. Like, they would have to work that track exactly where that animal had walked. So it was a little different. I think a deer can drift your track.
I was just thinking of that, and it made me start thinking about access a little differently. Like, so I guess let me just ask you that, like, knowing that, and like the time you spent running dogs, and especially when you start thinking about dogs drifting tracks, and maybe deer are able, or I mean, I'm sure they're able to, because they smell, however many times more, or better than a dog does. How do you kind of, I guess, let me ask it this way. How meticulous is your access, knowing everything that kind of how dogs react and how they drift tracks, and, and taking into consideration how much moisture is in the air and things like that? What extent and what pains do you go through to have clean access, and I guess exit as well?
I worked on that a lot. I mean, to me, well, I'll just say this: I just recently purchased my first farm, and I was really, really set on, like, I wanted northeast access on the farm. And preferably like the bedding more towards the opposite end of the farm, so I could set things up purposely, in a way to get in and out clean, because if it's a new farm, I would probably spend a little extra time, well, actually a lot more time in the winter walking it and trying to understand how to get in and out of it, and just trying to get the feel of how everything lays. And then I will come into some of those spots and say, yeah, this looks like a great spot, and this is how I'll access it. And I'll have kind of a game plan of like how I'm going to, come in, and maybe that's using some terrain features, or maybe there's a ditch or a creek or maybe there's going to be some standing corn, over there or whatever. And I'll try to use something to my advantage just to kind of, to be able to come in and out from a visual standpoint. Sometimes the set thing's tough because, it's, unless you know the farm and you've spent some time there hunting it, it takes a little time. I sometimes think it takes 2 years to learn a farm.
Yeah.
Because I think there's times where it's like, that's what a buddy of mine asked me. It was like, he goes, "You think you'll kill a buck on your farm this year?" I said, "No." I said I'd like to. I said that'd be ideal, but I'm like, I don't. I said I don't even know how the deer really move through that farm yet because I've never sat in a tree not one single time yet. Right. So I guess to your point, like, it just depends. It's all situational. But I know I try to do a lot of legwork in February, March, into April of how I'm going to get in and out of a new farm into areas. Here's the other part of that goes back to is like, then you go into the season and, sometimes it's like what you see during that time frame is not matching what you're seeing now, and you got to hunt them. You got to hunt the hottest signs. So,
right.
you're going to throw that out the window sometimes.
Next up is my buddy Jacob Emery. Jacob's from Kentucky, and we actually have 2 sections from him. This first one, though, what he's talking about is really his preference for the early season. Most people get all geeked up, for that last kind of end of October leading into the beginning of November. And Jacob really kind of prefers that super early season, I guess, if you will. Being from Kentucky, he has a velvet opportunity. And that's really his favorite time of year, especially if he can find a deer that's, as he kind of says, doing silly stuff. They'll oftentimes kind of write you a script in that early part of the year that you can make an ambush and put some fuzz on the wall. So we'll hear from Jacob here, and then we'll move into his second section.
No, I'd say I'm probably at about 20% of getting my cameras out. So I like to place a bunch of non-sales. I run the Tascos from Walmart. Honest to God, like 99% of my non-sailor cameras are Tascos. And I will set them about this time every year in some places I've never been before, and some places where, I've set cameras in the past and had great success, just kind of take inventory. And I'll let them soak for a month and a half, 2 months, go back in, pull the ones that aren't producing, and I'll have cell cameras with me in case one is producing and showing an early season deer, of course, because season comes in down here like September 3rd this year.
Right. Wow. Yeah. Because you have a velvet opportunity in Kentucky, right?
Oh yes, I live for early season. I mean, I would. People want to crucify me over this, but I would almost. I think actually I would, if I could hunt 1 week out of the year, I would rather hunt the first week of September than hunt middle November.
Really?
That's just me. Absolutely.
Why is that?
I love deer in velvet. If you can find the right one in the right spot that's doing stupid stuff while he's still got the fuzz, they're easier to kill. That's just my opinion. Now granted, I've only killed 2 velvet deer in my life, so they're a little bit harder to kill than you think, but it seems like every single year, like a day before season, man, the one I want to go kill just up and vanishes or something happens and it just don't work out. But I like the early season patterns. Just something about summertime scouting and stuff. I don't know, I've always taken to it. My best deer actually is a velvet buck that I killed in 2011. And I've yet to top him, but no, my goal this year is actually to kill a buck in Kentucky in velvet. And after that, it's a free for all. But right now I'm just trying to find one to hunt. I don't have one in mind. I don't have a deer from last year that I'm trying to target, and pretty much hunting all the same places that I always have, just trying a few different locations for cameras and setups. And when it gets closer to time, the best scouting tool you can have is your binoculars and your eyes.
Yeah.
As far as early season.
All right, this next session with Jacob What we're talking about is his trail camera strategy. And, everyone has a little bit of a different approach. Some of it's, environmental, where you might be hunting the types of things that are around the area that you're hunting. Me, for example, I don't chase a lot of food necessarily, because there aren't big destination kind of food sources in most of the places where I'm hunting. Most of the places I'm hunting, big woods, it's mainly browse. So you're focusing on those areas where deer want to congregate. That are either if it's a terrain feature that's going to pinch them in an area, or whether it's habitat related, so to speak. Where there's things get really brushy or thick. Or kind of defined areas of movement where you have just diversity of habitat kind of coming together, creating edges and stuff like that. What Jacob really kind of does, and he talks about here a little bit, is chasing food. For him, where he hunts, a lot of times that crop rotation plays a much bigger role in his trail camera strategy than it does mine per se. So let's go ahead and hear from Jacob.
Man, my trail camera strategy changes like from seasonal, I guess you'd say.
Mm-hmm.
Every single one of my sets right now, with the occasional community scrape, I mean, everything I'm setting right now is based off of food, ag,
Mm-hmm.
and from where they're going to be bedding to the food,
Mm-hmm.
Versus like huge terrain features and this and that they'd use later on. Deer around here, this is where it gets real tricky, is, everybody imagines like this little point off a hill, it's flat, that's where the buck's going to be bedding with the wind, over his back, he's going to be watching the bottom. These deer around here in ag will bed in the middle of agricultural, whether it's corn, beans, milo. When they gets tall enough, they'll bed out in the middle of it, and there really ain't no way to kill them.
Mm-hmm.
And you can say that you can sneak out there and try to. I mean, you're gonna be shooting. All you can see is the top of their head half the time.
Right.
So it gets kind of tough to hunt. So going back to hunting them early deer, finding that one deer that is using like a path or whatever it takes to get to the beans or the milo or the sunflowers, that's the one that I want to hunt. And, between 40 different cameras that I'll have set out, by late July, I'm hoping to have at least 2 deer that are acting silly in a silly spot.
Right. Now, do you, running that many cameras, do you often hunt off of, most, MRI, most recent intelligence? Like, so you pull a camera card or you have a cell camera and you're getting some intel and you're like, all right, I'm getting this weather front that's coming, I think that deer's killable now. I just need this wind and I'm going to go try to kill him. Or do you take a longer kind of view approach of like learning a piece of public or a part of a piece of public and hanging cameras, soaking them for a year, and then really kind of understanding how deer are using that piece particularly over the course of a season and what deer may be in those areas during different times of the year? What's your approach to that?
Yeah, it's definitely the most recent information
Okay.
because deer patterns down here in ag country change year to year based off what ag is, planted.
Yeah, that's a good
Deer,
point, man. I didn't think of that, the ag rotation aspect of it.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
today I was actually in a WMA office begging the guy for a layout of all the fields, like what are they planted in? And he wouldn't really let me have it, but he did show me a bunch of stuff on the map and whatnot. I was like, you just tell me where the soybeans are and I'll leave you alone.
Right.
Because everything is so late being planted down here and it's going to be fantastic. That means the beans are going to be green by the time season opens. That's a big thing. If they turn yellow,
Yeah.
they're dead. They're dead to deer. They won't touch them again until it's so cold they can barely walk.
Yep.
But the beans will be short and they'll be green, which means that they cannot bed out in the middle of them. They're going to have to work from somewhere to that food source. So they're planting all that stuff right now. And if my calculations are correct, this should be a great early season as far as the WMA that I'm hunting.
All right, this next segment is with our buddy Casey Smith from The Element. And if you know anything about these guys, man, they travel all over to hunt. And, one of the things we've talked about a fair amount on this show, just in general, is, how, especially when Tony Peterson and I get together, is how travel hunting and hunting different places, will ultimately kind of improve your abilities just in general, your strategic kind of thinking around hunting and stuff like that. And so in this segment, what, Casey and I are talking about and what he's kind of pointing out is kind of how his hunting style had evolved or changed, over time when he really started kind of travel hunting more and more. It kind of forced him to kind of look at things a little bit differently and hunt a little bit differently. And then net was it changed his overall kind of approach to hunting. And so that's what he's talking about in this segment. So let's go ahead and check it out.
Sure. Yeah. That's a neat thing to talk about, man, because it really does change you. And honestly, like even change the way you traditionally did stuff where you started hunting, because you learn so much when you travel. Of course, in the field is going to be the thing that is, the shiny thing to talk about, right? But even just like the way you prepare and the way you scout and do all that stuff as well, like changes a lot. But as far as like actual hunting goes, for a long time, I was a guy, well, when I first started hunting, we had a deer lease in Central Texas, and I was mostly a rifle hunter out of a box blind over bait pile. And that's the way it's done in Texas. Bait's always been legal. I don't know if it'll ever not be. And it's definitely for anybody who has never hunted a bait state, as we call them. It's not money in the bank like you might think it would be. It's still pretty tough. Deer get real wise, just like they're coming into a food source like acorns or persimmons or whatever. Like bucks especially know what they're doing around those things. And honestly, where I live, the average property size is probably like 12 acres. So there's a corn feeder at least every 20 acres. It ends up not being all that's cracked up to be, right? But anyway, so that's how I started hunting. And then I kind of developed a love for archery hunting, but still like in permanent stands. I shot my first buck out of a semi-permanent stand. I actually filmed that deer. That actually might come out on our YouTube channel this summer. That's going to be pretty cool because that was in 2005, I think. Nice. I shot my first archery buck. Yeah, and definitely a baby-faced KC shooting a bow from the early 90s, Right. Dude, I don't know how it happened, but no rangefinders, of course, right? Rangefinders were new technology in 2005.
That was high. That was high. Right? That was bougie.
Yeah, man, I didn't have a chance at one of those things. I was a high school kid hunting in my leather steel-toe boots, and I think I had some type of Walmart camo on and maybe a pair of blue jeans. I don't even know. But I just saw this buck come out. I was hunting kind of a hayfield edge, and he walked out into the pasture, and I grunt stopped him and shot him and guessed him at 35 yards and absolutely ripped him, double lunged him just to guess at 30. And then I was like, okay, cool. And now looking back, I'm like, dude, how on earth did you pull that off? With a bow. And I did the whole dumb thing where you like shoot your field points all year and you're like, oh, that's good. And then screw your broadheads on and put them on. Who knows what my arrow did? It might have just dropped right into it, like it's just doing a corkscrew and it worked out. I don't know. But humble beginnings for sure. And then starting to hunt public land, there's technically rules about how you're not supposed to leave your stands too long, this and that. And those things always get broken, but I never had enough money to set up like 4 or 5 different stands. So I always carried the same one. And I either left it in one spot or I'd leave it there for a week and then move it when I see deer moving elsewhere and all that. And then I finally found a really good spot. This is, let me think about some dates here. This would have been the fall of 2013, so about 9 years ago. I had scouted a place, ended up being like a 1.7 mile distance walk, and got to the point where I couldn't do that with a big heavy stand. So I was like, well, how am I going to make this work? And so that's kind of where my mobile hunting kind of started. I was still using a steel stand and all that, but I had to figure out the steps thing and how to bring them in and all that. And that's when I finally kind of had the thought of being mobile with hunting, but it's not like it's stuck or that's the way I started doing things all the time. It's just I learned that you could do that.
Right.
And then, so on and so forth. You start wanting to venture out and understand the concept of blowing out spots, or the concept of feeling pressure from other hunters, or whatever it is that might be a circumstance that makes you want to move. And then you realize how advantageous it is to be able to hop around. So then Tyler and I once we started hunting together, we went to using tree stands that had brackets on them, like those little Muddy Pros or whatever they were called, or Vantage, that's what it was. And we used those things a lot. And they were super comfortable, but it was kind of loud to put up and still kind of cumbersome. I remember Tyler and I talking back then, and we're like, man, it'd be cool to have a saddle. I see those guys talk about this stuff, and Tyler, I remember saying to him one time, he's like, man, I don't know if you can get comfortable on those things. And I was like, you're probably right. It looks real uncomfortable. Yeah. And then about 3 years ago, we got a couple to try out, and they were like, this isn't too bad. And now, I'm either saddle half the time or I'm on the ground half the time. And that's the way I hunt. And just look back and think that at one point in time, I hunted the same stand, no matter what wind direction it was. And that stand was in the tree all year long. It's like, man, that is night and day difference. And that's one of the big things that you learn traveling, is that the ability to be mobile is key. When you go to a place that you don't know much about, you're learning on the fly, the ability to take the knowledge you learn on the fly and convert that into moves that you make instantaneously. That's how you kill big deer when you're on the road. Yeah. You can't sit there and lay up. I don't know if you golf or I do a little bit, not a whole lot, but you can't lay up and hit the side of the water 3 or 4 times, because you got to go after that deer, and that ends up being the thing that translates the most to me, that I've learned that helps me kill deer on the road.
All right. This next sesh is, again, with our buddy Casey Smith from The Element. And another thing that we've talked about a lot on this show, and it was cool just to kind of talk to him about it, because, as you guys know, if you listen to the show for a while, I love to travel hunt. It's one of my favorite things to do. I go somewhere every year. And I typically go in blind and hunt most of these places because they're a fur piece from the house. So, I can't necessarily go scout them and have everything figured out before I get there. It's a lot of figuring it out while I'm there. And one of the things that we've talked about on this show, again, most specifically, I know I've talked to Tony about it, and I wanted to talk to KC about this as well, is just over time, you start to build these kind of analogs or a database of that you've seen, certain types of topography and terrain. And, you might be in Pennsylvania in a swamp, and when you get to Kansas or Missouri or something like that, there's just something, the way that the terrain lays, or the topography kind of lays out, or way the habitat kind of flows, or whatever it is, it just reminds you of somewhere that you've been before, even though it's not even remotely close to the same type of topography maybe that you hunted, that you're kind of referencing. But you've built this kind of ability to kind of draw these parallels over time and just through experience. And so that's really what Casey and I are talking about here. And it's really kind of him explaining kind of how he builds those analogies. And he talks a really kind of interesting way how he thinks about it is a filling in the blank kind of strategy. And that whitetails are whitetails no matter what, and you really just need to kind of fill in the blanks of a strategy, almost like a Word document that has sections left blank, and you have to fill those in. And once you fill those in, that is the kind of that's the thing that will kind of help you get close to a big buck, maybe in a new state or a new piece of property. So let's go ahead and listen to Casey kind of explain it.
Absolutely, dude. It's you have such a good example or analogy there, and the way I think of what you're saying is it's like a Word document template, and then you're just filling in the blanks.
Love that. Yeah.
With all that in there. That's still what Tyler and I like to talk about this a lot. Whitetail or whitetail, no matter where they are in the country, they have to do whitetail things. So you just take and fill in the gaps with the things that you can put it, in your favor wherever you are in the country, and that's your strategy for getting close to a big buck. Mm-hmm. Now, I will say, there's some things that throw me off because they're still so unpredictable, and that's why we love them, right? But I can go out to a plain state and think I have something figured out, but then all of a sudden you're on a different property where there's 17 variables that you haven't considered yet, and the deer are doing something exactly opposite of what you think they're going to do. You know, so like there's always like you're saying, like a new thing for the algorithm to encounter, right?
Yeah.
And learn from. And I'll say too, like I haven't logged enough data in the hill country. Like what I'm imagining that you might hunt quite a bit in Pennsylvania. You know, those what I would call ridges and hollers. I don't really know, you know, whatever y'all call them there, but that's tough for me. And so I kind of tend to shy away from hunting places like that just because I feel much more confident in other stuff.
All right. This next segment is with our buddy, one of my favorite people to talk deer with, just because the guy knows probably more about, has forgotten, maybe might be one way to say it, more about deer than I'll probably ever know. And the nice thing is when he talks about things, he has an interesting perspective because, one, he's a doctor, he's a biologist. So he looks at things from a very kind of scientific lens, but he's also a hunter, of course. And so he can kind of play both parts of what hunters, you know, want to believe or hope and what the data say when he's actually looking at studies. And that's Mr. Dr. Bronson Strickland from MSU Deer Lab. And in this segment, we're going to have two segments from him. I did a whole episode with him that was really all about kind of dispelling the buck bedding myths that we want to believe. And the second segment is more specifically about buck bedding consistency. But this first segment, what we're talking about is everyone's favorite topic, the October lull. And hopefully people know now by now that there's been enough kind of stated about it that's really not true. And so what we talk about here is he kind of talks about the lull and just kind of general deer movement over time. Especially during that early part of the year. And I think the preface to this, what I had mentioned was that, it's likely, the lull that people are experiencing is likely due to them being in the wrong place. Because, this time of year, that October timeframe for us Northerners or Midwesterners, it's a little different for the Southern folks. And he kind of talks to that a little bit. But it's a very dynamic time of year in the woods. Right. So there's changing food sources that are happening. Their biology, or not biology, but their physiology is changing, and what is driving their behaviors is changing a little bit. And the environment's changing because the foliage is coming off the trees. And so what once was good bedding isn't as good a bedding any longer. And so there's a lot of shifting and stuff that's happening this time of year in the whitetail range. And so that's kind of what we talk about in this segment here. So let's go ahead and hear from Dr. Strickland.
Let's frame something up first. Is for a lot of the U.S. that works to say, quote, October lull. If we were going to say that in Mississippi relative to, say, the time clock from the Midwest, we would have to call it the November lull.
Right.
And
got it. Yeah.
So Clint, like where you're at, where is the peak of the rut relative to October?
Usually, I think the peak breeding date is right around, I want to say like the 6th, if I'm not mistaken, of November.
Of November?
Yeah. 5th, 6th,
of November.
That, okay. Yeah, that time frame, I think, is the peak breeding date.
Yeah. Okay. So we're about a month to five weeks behind you. So what we see, which again can be in direct conflict with a lot of hunters and a lot of very popular hunters and TV programs and all that stuff, is this lull takes place. But when we look at the data, there is definitely a lull before the rut, but there was also a quote a lull before that. So it's not like when we end up summer and bachelor groups break up, we don't see a spike in activity and then it dips down and we see low activity, and then of course we see another spike with the pre-rut and the rut. That's not what we see at all. We just see baseline activity that is relatively low and a huge spike up, doubling or tripling daily movements when it comes to the pre-rut. And all that is correlated, with scraping activities and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
It just kind of all comes together. So it's kind of weird. It's like when you say a lull relative to what?
Right. Yeah.
A lull relative to the rut? Well, of course there is.
Right.
But a lull relative to September? No, we don't see that.
Right. And I think where a lot of people get that, right, is they're basing their activity kind of perception, right, or understanding off of maybe trail cameras that they've placed to capture summer inventory or early fall inventory, or areas that they might hunt during the earlier part of the season that might be closer to field edges and stuff like that before the pressure gets to, where those are still the primary food sources before acorns start dropping and things of that nature. And so I think it's probably more of a consequence of people being in the wrong spot versus the deer actually lulling, so to speak, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I would call it that there's a change, but it's probably more of a spatial shift in where the buck is at versus overall his movement activity is less.
Right. Right.
I think that corresponds very well with what you've observed, and that and food is changing at that point too. So when we do see these shifts, they are typically happening before the rut and after the rut, and not during the rut.
Right.
It's kind of like once they decide this is where I'm going to be for 2 to 3 weeks during the rut, that's typically where they stay. Right. And if they're going to, get up and move a couple miles away, that usually happens pre or post rut.
All right. This next segment is again with our buddy, Mr. Dr. Bronson Strickland. And what we're talking about, and this I alluded to it in the previous kind of mention, is buck bedding consistency, early season versus the rut. Conventional wisdom has always been, if you've read any magazine, listened to any deer hunter, pretty much anywhere, what you will always hear is that, that early season time frame, just call it October, for us Northerners and Midwesterners again. And that time frame is when a buck is going to bed most consistent. He's going to have his kind of bedding areas that he's going to, his haunts. Once he makes his fall shift, from his summer range to his fall range, he's going to have those consistent kind of bedding areas, and they're going to be, consistent and killable in those, particular areas. More so that time of year than say when you get to rut, when they're, quote unquote, running all about, making mistakes, day walking, and things of that nature. And that's conventional wisdom. That's what we've all kind of lived and died by, right? And that's, it's just, if you listen to anybody talk about October versus November hunting, a lot of guys will say they prefer that October time frame because they can get on a buck and he's consistent, he'll bed in certain areas, and you have a better chance of killing him. And what this study had shown is really that is not the case. The actual opposite is true. And so with that, we'll just kind of go ahead and jump into it and let Dr. Strickland provide the explanation.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we have a couple hypotheses, and that's all we can propose is here are some ecologically some reasonable explanations. But heck, we don't know and we never will. But so when you look at the October data, which again are far more scattered, my hunter / conventional wisdom would have also been initially, it's going to be much more of a pattern that time of year. Mm-hmm. It is going to be a lot more like, say, a buck bachelor group where every single day they're going to this field and they're going to go bed down here. But we actually see a lot more movement and a lot more what appears random. But what could be going on is, number one, there's very few hunters, relatively few hunters on the landscape at that time. That's literally when these data are from the very first week of archery season. So there's little disturbance. There's also changes going on with mast availability. So you may have some hard mass, maybe just starting to drop, and a buck is working through there trying to figure out where those places are at. We also have crops. So we have those summer cash crops, what is left in those fields, and then we have food plots being planted. So we also have a lot of variability potentially in food on the landscape with little human pressure.
Right.
If we fast forward that 2 months, everything's changed. What grain or whatever was left in the ag fields, that's probably been exhausted. The agronomic foods are going to be food plots. The mast at this point may or may not have been completely exhausted by now. And the deer know that hunters are out there. The pressure is on. So he just may be in fewer places right now because he knows he's being hunted.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's the other thing that I found interesting too is that scatter plot got tighter, but a lot of the other thing that flew in the face to me a little bit of conventional wisdom was that it's almost as though his core area got smaller. And you always hear, a buck, they start to range out during, that time of year. It would have made more sense to me if we were looking at a buck that was, say, 5.5, 6 years old or 7 years old. You know what I mean? Like a deer that maybe is like, I've heard, I don't have any proof, of course, right? But another piece of conventional wisdom is that as a buck gets older, in a lot of instances, potentially, right? Again, this is all hunter wisdom, that they start to shrink their core area. They know where they're safe. They know where danger is. They have an area that they feel really safe in, and they kind of know where their doe family groups are at, and they're going to kind of work those doe family groups, and they're just not going to expose themselves. And which can make it harder to kill them. It can also make it potentially easier to kill them. And so this would have looked like, to me, I would have been like, yeah, this makes sense if this is like a 6-year-old buck. But like, when I'm looking at a 3.5-year-old, I'm going, man, that's like a teenager or like a 21-year-old. Like he should be out partying. You know what I mean? Like,
right. Throw caution to the wind.
Right, exactly. And so that's the other part that really kind of, I guess, surprised me, was like how tight his core area was. Were any of these areas, I guess let me ask this question first. So you have bucks that are collared. I'm assuming you have a bunch of does that are collared in this same area too, right?
Unfortunately, we do not.
Oh, okay.
I wish we did. These are bucks only.
Okay, because you can probably figure out where my next question was going. My next question was this pre-rut or this peak rut kind of area. I'd be curious to know if any of these bedding areas are adjacent, downwind, or how close they may or may not be to where we might have doe family groups that are bedding, especially close to these food sources potentially.
Buddy, you and me both. I want to know that as well.
Oh man, yeah, that's awesome. Because that was my first my first thought was that, and I don't think it describes or would answer all like the tightening of the core area questions and things of that nature. It would just be a piece of the puzzle, but it would be interesting to kind of consider. But I mean, based on what you know about deer biology and behavior and things of that, I mean, what would be your gut feeling around, like, looking at the landscape there, would you feel like some of these areas are kind of prime locations for, him bedding downwind or close to a doe bedding area?
Oh, absolutely. I have no doubt that's what's going on. I just wish we could quantify it and prove it. Yeah. So, I mean, like if you're looking at that figure, if he's down in that little, the little cover spot south of the larger, I bet $1,000 there's a doe social group located in that wood block,
right,
to the north.
Yeah.
He's going to be in proximity of that.
Right. Yeah.
And here's another way to think about this, Clint. You touched on some things that are really interesting, and we actually we're hoping to get it launched right before deer season. But we have put all of this together, all of these analyses together in a document, and it's going to be free of charge, free to download, print yourself, the whole deal. But we're looking at a lot of this stuff, like and here's one I think you might think is interesting, is that it's the way we talk about the buck's home range, and there's so many assumptions and the way you kind of think of that. And so what happens is we think that the buck's home range is getting bigger during the rut, for example. But it's all based on scale. And here's what I mean. When you look at then the daily footprint or weekly footprint of most of these bucks, it's about the same. But what happens during the rut is that there is a shift. And so instead of using 50 acres in one day, and then the very next day using the same 50 acres, is that it may move over. It may overlap a little bit with the original 50 acres, but there's only a little bit of overlap. And so he's using a new 50 acres adjacent to it. And then a week later, so it's like, are we talking about a daily scale of where the buck is at, a weekly scale, or a seasonal scale? So when this seasonal home range gets bigger, it's just because collectively, all of those weekly home ranges are not on top of each other, they're adjacent to each other.
All right, this next sesh is with our good buddy, you know him, you love him, Mr. Greg, by God, Litzinger. And in this segment, what we're talking about is just how over time he's kind of gone, from earlier, I guess, in his hunting career, he went from, doing all of his, what we'll say off-season work during the course of the winter and just kind of letting the woods, the deer have the woods all summer long to, life happens, and I'm experiencing it this year. Life happens. You get married, you become a dad, or whatever the case is, and that winter time isn't always as free as you would like, and so a lot of your work might fall into the summer, just for whatever reason, whether it's family obligations or weather in combination with family obligations, whatever the case is. And so what he talks about is just being way more efficient whenever he used to get most of his stuff done in the winter. And I don't think it's necessarily because the winter is, it's great to be able to get out and winter scout, no doubt. But I think there's a little bit of a difference whenever you're in areas like New Jersey or, Michigan, because this is something he picked up from John Eberhart, and he mentions that, or high pressure areas in PA, where the deer are maybe just a little bit more sensitive to that intrusion that close to the hunting season. And so he talks a little bit here about being efficient and working smarter.
When I was very efficient at killing many, it seems like a decade ago.
When I was just a young Greg.
Yeah. When I was really like operating at my peak, I never scouted in summertime. John Eberhart, like when I read that's what he did, like very minimal scouting in summertime, because you don't want to alert the deer to what you're doing. I don't want to alert the deer to what I was doing, but also at the same time, it's like, it's hot. I don't go in the woods. Right. Like I blew it out. All my trees were done. Now, as I get older and family, like I don't have 2 days every weekend to spend in the woods or after work. So I was doing a lot of summer scouting in the last couple of years. I'm not really seeing the deer in October that I used to see. So
right.
I'm kind of going back to, I'll scout pretty much to now throw out some cameras or try to cut a track or something.
Right.
But a lot of my scouting is I'm glassing bean fields.
Mm-hmm.
Why? I still can before they get too tall, because Jersey's got a lot of hybrid beans. They get like 6 feet.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Become like mid-August, they're about 5-6 feet. So a lot of deer are hidden. So I know what a big deer looks like this time of year. I have 3 that around me that if they start fill out, they're a possible target bucks. But I'm just glassing in a net, just driving down the road, glassing deer and walking the edges of the bean fields. Like, oh, there's a track. Mark it.
So you're using easy access places when you are going out, even, and just trying to see, like,
because they're coming to beans. Like, there's no. I mean, it's a perk of farm country basically. So there's a lot of beans, a lot of corn.
Right.
Can't really do much about the corn, but deer this time of year aren't really spending too much time in the corn because of their antlers. So they spend a lot of time in the beans. Well, I can just glass the last hour light, so I'm almost every day I'm glassing
probably
the last
even
hour
in some
light.
ways it's probably even better than camera inventory at that point. You know what I mean? As far as just like gathering inventory.
Yeah. And it's just like, no, all right, boom, there's 4 bucks over here, and there's one area that was, I seen them like 3 weeks ago. I was like, man, these bucks might turn into something. They're nice deer, but nothing I'm going to waste my time in. In the spot, it's a huntable spot where they're coming out of. It's right in private, public, and nobody hunts there. But I got spots in there. There's nothing worth shooting.
Right.
To me, it's like I walked the edge of the bean field. There's one big track, but it's a bigger body buck. There's a group of 4 bucks there, and it's like, So I'm literally just kind of just writing that spot off. I'm not even going to waste my time.
Right.
And so it's like, all right, on to the next. I still drive by with a net, so a net can see them.
Right.
But they're young. They're like clockwork. It's like, boom, they're there almost every day.
7:15. Here they come.
I was like, the bigger guys, and they don't mind the car stopping. I mean, they're like 300 yards away. They don't mind the car stopping. And the deer's been around in Jersey. If you stop,
they're gone.
He's like, okay, I'm going back in the woods.
So this next sesh is with, again, our good buddy, Mr. Greg Litzinger. And if you've listened to any of the episodes he and I have done together for the past 2 to 3 years, you've likely heard us talking about targeting specific dates. Everybody kind of knows those kind of classic rut dates to look to pinpoint, if you know what your peak breeding date is, in the earlier part of November, and then again in the later part of November, or December rather, whenever does cycle back in, then you'll kind of know, the 2 or 3, maybe 4 days on the front side of that when things are just going to kind of be bananas whenever they're cutting does out. I use that date for whenever I go to Kansas. I know the spot that I go to. There's a specific date where you don't want to miss. Doesn't mean it's not good other days, but it's just I've heard I learned this from a friend who told me this, and then I witnessed it, 2 years in a row where it's like this specific date is just bonkers. There's just deer everywhere. I think last year I saw 30 deer on that date. But that's November. Everyone kind of targets those dates, right? And so over time, what Greg had learned, he had passed along to me, and then I validated it with just trail camera data, and then being in the woods on these dates and kind of observing it from the tree myself, is just there are a handful of days in a certain part of October that is very overlooked. That you'll usually get that mature deer in the area. At least what I've seen them, the king. The king shit of Turd Island, if you will. Mature buck of the area will make his first kind of daylight mistake in this particular time frame, and you just need to be at the right spot to kind of take advantage of it. And we've mentioned this a couple of different times, and so we follow up and we talk a little bit about it here, and just further validation that Greg has seen over the course of time.
I would say 3 to 5 years.
3 to 5.
Yeah, 1 year, 2. But if that time frame corresponds with the data you've already had, years past, and you can start to put, I'm like, all right, well, my date in October.
Yeah.
So it's like that date in October works wherever I've been. It's like it's just a great time to be in the woods. It doesn't matter where I'm hunting. Yeah. So, and that was from just trial and error. Years of hunting in those days, it's like, wow, I'm seeing a lot of bucks. Why? Don't know. It's like,
then all of a sudden, truck came, and you're like, oh, there you go.
Yeah, and then so you're like, okay, those dates are very consistent. So, I was at the Michigan TAC. There's some hardcore people in Michigan, man.
For sure, man.
Dude,
tons of people from Michigan listen to this. Shout out to everyone from Michigan, man. You guys are killers.
Dude, straight gangsters, man. They live and breathe hunting. And I talked to probably a handful of guys, and they correspond with my thoughts on the mid-October movement. They're like, dude, every year I can count on it. It's like clockwork. Somewhere on that property, this is going to happen. I'm like, I know, right? And he goes, and the one guy's like, I hunted those days because you told me those dates. So he goes, and I see deer. He goes, and it here, and then it's gone. There's a 3 or 4 day window, and then it disappears, and then there's a 7-day lull, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. All right, gang, that is the last segment for this particular look back session. Hopefully you guys dug the episode. I always dig putting these together. It reminds me of things that I probably should remember as I'm headed into the next hunting season. And maybe I'll try to see if I can find some time to dig back through the archives and maybe pull out some nuggets that are worth us remembering as we get ready to head into this fall. I know we're here at the beginning of June, man, but the season's fast approaching, and it will be here before we know it. All right, folks, that is a wrap for today's show. I'd like to thank all of you for listening, and if you haven't yet, please head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast. And while you're at it, head over to YouTube and give us a sub there as well. I'd be super appreciative if you do those couple things for me. And before I shut this thing down, we need to give a big shout out to our partners who continue to help us make this podcast possible. Tethered, Exodus Outdoor Gear, and Genesee Beer. And until next time, we'll see y'all.